Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Patrick Jagoda. Dr. Jagoda is an English professor and a cinema and media studies professor at the University of Chicago. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
We are here to discuss games and American culture. You've published something recently, Experimental Games, Critique, Play, and Design in the Age of Gamification. And I would like to ask you about something you said. You said that you thought that if Shakespeare were alive today, he would be designing games. Why do you say that?
I think that's right. I mean, during the early modern period, you had the stage. Today, we have the screen. And where Shakespeare was focusing on language and the body as it was performing, today we have these very sophisticated video games that include graphics and sound and animation and different forms of interactivity. I mean, this art form is the state of the art of where we're at right now.
But is it the quality of the art, right? I mean, Shakespeare has been quoted now for 400 years. Will people be remembering things that we did with these games? Is there something more meaningful here?
I think so. I mean, the games that I grew up with were Nintendo games, were Sega games in the 1980s and 1990s. Yeah. Those weren't that sophisticated. But starting around 2007, 2008, you really saw this uptick of art games and independent games, some of which are every bit as sophisticated as the novels that I teach.
Yeah. Well, so for instance, tell us about one of these games that you think is operating on that level.
Yeah, so there was a game that came out about a year and a half ago called Disco Elysium, and this game was written by a novelist. The game is comprised of about 1 million words, so this is at least 5 times as long as a long novel. And in addition to that language, that multi-linear narrative, you have amazing graphics and game mechanics and things like that. So it's a real layering of different art forms on top of each other.
And just like if someone were reading a novel, then they're learning about the personalities and the actions of the characters. Yeah. It's an interesting thing because I think with movies, I know, and a lot of times with novels, people discuss what if there was an alternate ending, right? What if Rhett Butler didn't leave Scarlett, and and I know with a lot of films they shoot several endings and then they show them to focus groups and stuff. But these game scenarios that you're talking about, they actually have several endings built in. Am I right?
That's right, and these sort of like interactive films almost go back to the 1980s. So you had things like Dragon's Lair, or you had early CD-ROMs like The Seventh Guest that offered many sort of choices and different endings. But now you have hundreds of games that offer multiple choices and endings. And
you've talked about how this is integrated into the culture to the extent that in a lot of professions and industries, they're actually using game structures in order to explore potential outcomes and things like that, right?
That's right. So one of the ways of calling this is gamification. And gamification is the use of game mechanics and game rules to intervene in some area that has nothing to do with games. So you see this in consumerism, you see this in the military, you see this in education. So you have games which seem frivolous making their way into very serious parts of society.
Yeah. So there's 2 sides to it, right? There's the literary entertainment side, which you're exploring, and then there's also this practical, almost like learning chess so you can be more strategic side to it, right?
That's exactly right. And they are slightly different undertakings, but you see some of the same game designers engaging in both.
Let's start with chess for a second, right?
Sure.
What in terms of the history of chess, how has it been used to prepare people for other things?
Yeah, so initially chess was just a strategic game. But over time, you saw applications of it, for instance, to the military. So in the 19th century, we saw Prussian war games like Kriegspiel being used to train commanders in the military. We, of course, have contemporary counterparts to this. So yeah. America's Army is an example of a game that the U.S. military has used to train and recruit new people to join the Army.
Interesting. So they're actually using it for training people, though.
Yes.
How long has that been going on?
Well, you see different forms of it for several decades now.
Really?
It hasn't always been successful, but sometimes people who play first-person shooters find their way into the military, and the military has funded various forms of projects as well, mainstream video game projects.
Yeah. What's the social implications of these things here? Because a lot of them have to do with some pretty, heavy-duty violence and, tragic things happening when you think about it, right?
Sure. I mean, the media loves to blame video games for causing violence, for producing addiction.
Well, and let's not go that far yet.
Okay.
I mean, just but I mean, just what's the overall? Does it say something about what we're interested in, or do you think it's more directing us to be interested in something?
Yeah, I mean, I think games started to become really popular. Video games started to become very popular in the 1970s and 1980s. And this was a moment where we moved from computers as calculation devices to computers as expressive media.
Yeah.
A lot of our games, a lot of our video games are competitive. They don't necessarily have to be, right? You could imagine cooperative games, you could imagine role-playing games, and yet, particularly in American society, so many games are competitive. And this maps very much onto our economic and political structures, especially starting in the 1970s and 1980s.
With the neoliberalism and all of that, right?
That's right.
Let's get into that a little bit. What's the connection between the neoliberal trend and gaming?
Yeah, so I mean, neoliberalism, right, in the 1970s sees us moving from the planned economy of World War II toward deregulation, toward a rising interest in private property, the free market, greater entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that around the same time that neoliberalism takes off, we see video games taking off. In the 1970s in the arcades, in the 1980s with the Nintendo Entertainment System, and things like that. So it's not that one causes the other, but there's a kind of correlation between economics and culture that we see playing out within competitive video games in particular.
Yeah. Now, for people who aren't familiar with the term, when we say neoliberalism, we're not talking about Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Essentially, it means a liberal approach to the development of business, essentially. Less government restrictions. How am I doing here? Is
That's great. I mean, I think
Yeah.
of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the
Yeah.
1980s as being
Yeah.
the kind of political counterpart to this.
There's also something that's kind of selfish about that, right? I mean, it's almost contrary to the golden rule. The golden rule in most cultures, and it's not something that's just we just associate with Christianity, right? But the golden rule is essentially do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? But the neoliberal perspective of economics is take what you can get.
Sure. With neoliberalism, the idea is you promote competition, and sometimes that competition becomes predatory. I mean, we saw this during the 2008 financial crisis, for instance, in which there was predatory lending. That's absolutely an example of the financial sector deploying a form of neoliberalism.
If our culture is more focused on those kinds of things, right, doesn't it say that we're moving in that direction, that we're less concerned about others and more concerned about what we can achieve and what we can get out of situations?
I think that's absolutely true. There is something selfish about that, and I think competitive video games help naturalize that, right? Video games are, again, they seem frivolous. They feel like hobbies, like something you do in the evening for fun. But in fact, as you're playing a competitive video game, you're getting a taste for these kinds of engagements, for self-entrepreneurship, for competition. And some people might think that that's a positive thing. I happen to not think that, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a positive side to it, I think. I think understanding our desire and the joy of being competitive, I think, is part of the human experience. But I know as I was watching my kids growing up, and they're playing these video games, and they're blowing people up and mowing them down with machine guns and stuff. I wasn't worried that they were going to go out and do that. I was just worried that it was just changing their view of who they are and how they saw other people, if you know what I'm saying, right?
Yep.
Sort of the golden rule versus Adam Smith's rule.
Sure, and one thing that it was doing was it was getting them accustomed to sitting in front of a screen for long periods of time,
that too, right?
I mean, I was like your kids. I mean, I grew up playing video games, and I did not want to go outside. I wanted to spend more time with my Super Mario game.
Yeah, well, it paid off for you.
In this case, yes.
Roger Ebert, you mentioned, said that he thought that gaming would never be considered an art. Why did he say that, and why is that? Why do we think that's probably not true now?
Well, Roger Ebert was a film critic, and he spent his entire life studying film art, and film can be really amazing. But he believes that video games were just too superficial to ever become art. That's changed. I mean, around 2007, 2008, we started to see the rise of video game auteurs, very much like the kind of film directors of a previous era. We saw video games ending up at the Smithsonian or MoMA, which had a collection of video games. And you started to see games that, again, were every bit as sophisticated as the great novels or the great films of previous eras.
Yeah, that's interesting. Are there forums where people talk about these games? I know, if you're interested in literature, you can join a book club, or you can you can take a class at University of Chicago, right? But with games, it seems like, if we make the comparison to books, it would be like if you're playing the game all the time, it's like you're just rereading the book, right? But are there spaces where people go to talk about the games like they would talk about the book?
It's a really great question because, of course, I say this all the time, is young people study short stories and novels from a very early age, right? You're in middle school and you're studying literature. Same with film. In sometimes high school, sometimes college, you take film studies courses. Game studies is a very recent field. And so students, young people, talk about games all the time, but in terms of having a critical vocabulary for analyzing them, that's a fairly new thing. And I think it's really important to be able to digest and change the culture that you're a part of, not just reproduce it.
Well, so let's take this to the university. Are there classes where you assign games and people come into class and you talk about the games? How does that work?
Yeah, so I teach a huge critical video game studies course that's about 10 weeks long, and all we do is play video games and read philosophy, cultural studies, different kinds of analyses of those games. And then, I also teach game design courses where we read things about the principles of games and then try to make games that are more just, that produce positive outcomes instead of negative ones.
Sort of the parallel to the creative writing course.
That's right.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Now, you design games as well, right?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
So I design video games, board games, but I also design something called alternate reality games. And these are narrative-driven scavenger hunts that unfold both online and in physical space. And so we've created these games around topics like climate change, around issues of diversity and inclusion, even about the COVID-19 pandemic last year.
Well, walk us through one of those. Let's take the pandemic. How's that game work?
Sure. So with these games, you actually don't tell people that they're playing a game. They discover it along the way. There are all kinds of cues suggesting that that's what they're doing. But instead of having...
Wait, so where does this take place then?
This takes place online, so you might, we have things called rabbit holes. So rabbit holes are ways into the game through a puzzle, through something you find on Facebook or Instagram or on a website online.
Okay.
People find their ways into the game, find there's a community playing it, and over the course of weeks or even months, they go through a narrative, they solve puzzles together through different media. So you might be jumping from Facebook to TikTok to Twitch.
But you're playing a game if you're doing that.
You eventually probably know that you're playing a game. I mean, I've run these games with high school students before where they're not entirely sure. And that uncertainty is really, really powerful because when you're reading a novel, you have the suspension of disbelief, right? You know you're reading a novel, you know the story's not real, but you get into it. You want to immerse yourself.
Yeah.
With these games, you're never 100% sure, and it allows you to actually do things to social media, to the world, that you otherwise might not be able to do. I mean, there's a downside to this, which are groups like QAnon, right? QAnon in many ways uses many of the same principles of alternate reality games, right? Many people have likened QAnon to a game, even though it's not entirely.
Okay, well, explain this alternate reality game a little bit more here. So, is somebody who goes down one of these rabbit holes?
Yeah.
You're calling it, right? They know they're going down a rabbit hole.
They might or might not. I mean, early on they might not. So I'll give you an example. So we made one of these games for the orientation at the University of Chicago for all 1,800 incoming students.
Okay.
And we created a secret society. A secret society that we claimed existed since the year 1895. There was no such secret society, but we created fake documents, we created
how did you present this to them?
Well, so we slowly started to dole things out to them through emails, through different media as they were making their way to the university.
Okay, but you're being dishonest here, right? I mean, you're sending them an email about something that doesn't exist.
No, we're inviting them to make a world together. At the end of the day...
But they don't know that it's a game.
Well, they figured it out, and they made the game into their own sort of thing. There's a difference between lying and inviting someone into a fiction. I think there's a very big difference.
But if they don't know they're being invited into the fiction?
They know. There are all kinds of winks. They
I
started talking about it amongst one another.
Okay.
But they discovered that themselves. And that was really powerful because, again, if you're watching a film, you know how to watch a film, right? Like,
Yeah.
you've been conditioned to do that your entire life.
Yeah.
With one of these things, you're literally figuring out what the art form is and what the conventions are. That's a much more creative and dynamic process.
I mean, it sounds great. I love it. It's fascinating. But I'm just curious about how this works.
Sure. So, there's this stereotype of gamers, sitting in their basements playing games by themselves.
Yeah.
In reality, games are immensely social. And we try to really tap into that sociality with the games we create.
So what's the social element? If I'm sitting at my computer by myself, how can I see that as being a social?
Also, there are so many things that you could do because of the internet, using Discord, using Slack, using social media, where you're connected to other people. Before the pandemic, when we created these games, we also created live meetup situations where people could actually get away from the screen and actually interact with one another in physical space. And there, I would work with amazing theater people and performance people to stage these kind of amazing in-person set pieces.
Okay. Well, so let's get back to the games you're designing. So I digress there, but tell me a little bit more about those.
Sure. So with many of our games, we're trying. So I'll give you the example of the pandemic game. So we created a game called Echo to connect the students at the University of Chicago and the surrounding community at a time where people felt really disconnected. And so they got into teams, they got hundreds of quests that they could solve together, and suddenly they had something to do together, like not just competitively, but they had a story that they were invested in and that they wanted to see through. And we listened to them, we incorporated their choices into the narrative. So this was an improvised collective narrative that we created for them.
And how did that turn out? I mean, if somebody's gone through that, what's the benefit from it?
I think many things. Like, in order to finish these quests, people had to learn things. They had to learn from one another. So our quests are as diverse as having to speak Japanese or Polish or Spanish in order to traverse a quest. Or you might have to know advanced mathematics, or you might have to be a very sophisticated game player. So part of what it does is it creates this kind of interdisciplinary atmosphere where people can collaborate with one another in new ways.
Okay, and then and another application of this is what you call sandboxes, when games are used as sandboxes where you can test different realities and things. What's a use of that?
Sure. So one of the most popular sandbox games is Minecraft. Minecraft is played by so many young people, and it's a space where you build amazing things, right? People have built simulations of computers within Minecraft, or they've created roller coasters or sophisticated towns. So it's almost like a digital Lego in that case. In other games, like massively multiplayer online games, people create teams or guilds and have really elaborate social lives while they're engaging in this shared passion that they have, this shared game.
And how might they test out potential future events in a situation like that?
Well, part of what people are trying out in those spaces are different kinds of identities, right? Like, I see young people, trying out who they want to be in these kind of open-ended experimental spaces. But there are ways of testing out, alternative political systems or alternative economies, depending on how a game like that is structured.
And that's being done.
Yeah, I think more often than not, you see first-person shooters or real-time strategy games that aren't necessarily so experimental. They make a lot of money, but they're not that experimental.
Right.
But people find really interesting ways to break games and play them in ways that designers didn't intend necessarily as well. So when we talk about games, it's not just about the form of the game, it's also the play styles that they elicit.
So unlike novels then, the games can evolve into things that the creator maybe didn't anticipate, right?
Absolutely. A good example of this is, like, even if you play Monopoly at home, right? A lot of people have their own house rules for how to play Monopoly.
Everybody does, right? Yeah.
And that's, like, with video games, it's that, but many times more sophisticated. People will turn a competitive game into a cooperative game, or they'll use a weapon in order to jump rather than shoot someone. And again, these are things that are oftentimes not tested, but they show the creativity of players, not just designers.
one of the games you mentioned was called The Parasite, I think.
Yeah.
How does that work?
So The Parasite was this orientation game that we created at the University of Chicago for all of the incoming students. And this was a game where we were really interested in issues of diversity and inclusion. So thinking about making the university welcome all of the new students who were coming in and having people connect to one another in positive ways. We were thinking, for instance, about first-generation students who might not have grown up with a lot of privilege. How do you get those students comfortable going to office hours and speaking to professors right off the bat, even if they didn't have the privilege of knowing that going in? Or how do you have them ask for extensions in respectful ways? These were things that we could build into the game, and students were learning how to do that without knowing they were learning to do it, right? So that those lessons were integrated.
Yeah, and you're acclimating them to the culture essentially in a way that's natural and even though it's artificial, it's lacking the artificiality of having to learn it.
That's right.
Right, in a formal sense.
Yeah.
So, what game did you play when you were younger, and what are you playing now?
I played Super Mario Brothers. As you know, as many people of my generation in the 1980s, the Nintendo Entertainment System was the thing that I grew up on, and so I ended up playing Mario and Zelda and games like that. The sophisticated games that I teach today just didn't exist back then. I mean, now I play everything that I can get my hands on because, you know, as I've said, I think this is the most important cultural form that we have at the moment, and yeah.
So if somebody's good at these games, what skills is this draw on? Is this more for math people? Is it more for lit people? What's the, you know?
So for a time, games depended very heavily on hand-eye coordination,
Yeah.
and were very limiting in that way, right? You had to have the set of skills. Games weren't very inclusive, but that's changed. Around the 2000s, you saw the rise of casual games, things like Candy Crush, which you can play on your phone. We also saw the rise of narrative games. So there are games that are completely about the story and don't require any skill beyond the making of choices. And so one of the most amazing things about games is how diverse they've become, how many forms, how many genres, how many types of stories we have. Again, back in the day, you had platformers, you had racing games, you had maze games. Now you have hundreds of different genres.
So some of these are simple games, obviously, and we're not contending that these very simple games have the nuances and the extended meanings of the more complicated ones. What's the economic side of this? Who makes money off of this?
Well, I mean, the video game industry is worth more than the film industry and the music industry combined.
No way.
Much more. So last year, for instance, the film industry made something like $4 or $5 billion in terms of box office. The video game industry was $180 million.
Wow.
I mean, it's a huge scale. Like film is a tiny, tiny form these days compared to video games. It's a little bit more complicated than that because Netflix and Amazon and Hulu, of course, give us these streaming experiences as well. But you see those companies trying to get into video game production because, again, that's where young people go to get their stories, basically, and get their experiences.
And I'm sure those numbers dwarf even more with the publication industry, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
The number of books that people are reading.
That's right.
Do you still read? Do you still read novels, or have you find that boring at this point?
I'm an English professor, so if I told you that I didn't read novels, I would
You'd
lose
be in
my
trouble?
job.
Yeah.
No, I absolutely read. I read, I watch films, I experience every form of culture that I can. I go to the theater when it's possible outside of COVID. And again, I think there's a really amazing conversation happening between these art forms, between novels and games, for instance, in the way that we were talking about. And there's so much language in the games that we play, right? So many games are text-based as well.
Yeah, and I suppose they're dependent to some extent on the context and the meanings that have been generated over the years from novels and poetry.
That's right.
I think Shelley said that poets were the legislators of the culture, right? Would we say now that that these game creators are legislating the culture for us in some ways?
I think more and more, and I don't always think that it's the mainstream game creators, it's also the people who are making independent games. I mean, you see, there's a game called Stardew Valley that I really love that's a farm simulation game. And this was a game that was largely created by one person and ended up making millions upon millions of dollars. So sometimes, somebody can make one of these games at home without a huge production costs and still be very successful with what they're doing.
Yeah, like publishing your own novel almost, right?
Yeah, except more successful than that.
More successful. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Patrick Jagoda for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.